Greetings and welcome back. We are in a series of conversations about the Bible and what we are calling our non-apologetic study of the Bible. I hope that you've already watched the original first two lectures. This is lecture number 6 from Genesis 4. My hope is that you've watched the first 5 lectures, for sure the first 2 lectures, just so that you've got a sense of what's going on. We now turn to what often is referred to as the Cain and Abel story. We'll have a lot to say about that one here coming now. We want to see some of the parallels right away. We'll say this. Between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, if there's anything I'm trying to do, it's to convince you that the reading of this text is compelling. There's a reason, there's multiple reasons to be enjoying this text, and I hope that this lecture will help you see that even more. It's interesting that the word family is not going to get used in this text for chapter 4, but clearly this is going to be a story about family. We're going to talk about the motifs of family and brothers and sibling rivalry and all that kind of stuff. Now, just to point out, though, getting thrown out of the garden at the end of the 3rd chapter is a form of exile. No question about it. We mentioned already the importance of exile. We're going to see exile again being an important part of how this story of chapter 4 will also end. I want to point out, there's such terrific storytelling that's going to take place. I tried to make that argument when I was talking about chapter 3. I'll say this again with chapter 4. Just to remind, though, before we get started, we are engaging in a non-apologetic study of this text. We're not interested in arguing the validity or the invalidity of the text. We're simply wanting to look at it as a work of literature. And as such, we're going to take an annotative approach that follows the work that we often do in 303, a 3-level approach where we're going to ask, what does the text say? Then we're going to try to answer, what does the text mean? We're going to look at issues like themes, messages, motifs. We're also going to look at rhetorical issues, not what the author says, but how the author says it. We'll also be trying to answer the question, how does this text relate to other texts I'm familiar with, both within the biblical text as well as outside of it. For example, we're going to mention some classic titles here, as we've done in prior lectures. And then finally, we're going to ask maybe some personal questions. What is your own response to the text? Unlike what I've done in the past where I read the entire passage, what I think I'm going to do for this passage here is just to read it one verse at a time. And as we go through it, then we'll be working at all 3 levels simultaneously. Let's go ahead and turn now, again, just to remind you from earlier lectures, I'm working with the New Oxford Annotated Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. This is the augmented 3rd edition. For those of you that would like to go online and find this, you're obviously free to do that or to work with any other translation that you're so inclined. Let's go ahead and begin now. Open your text to Genesis chapter 4. And let's begin. I'll read a verse and then we'll exegete or talk about it, okay? Now, the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Now let's just turn for a few moments and just point out, I love the word now, just like chapter 3, verse 1, you've got great storytelling that's about to happen. Notice that Adam is not called Adam, but rather just simply the man. And notice that the word knew relates somehow to knowledge of sex, procreation. Does this change at all the idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil for you in Genesis 3? And it's interesting to ask, why this use of knowledge and sexual understanding? Is it possible that we don't really know someone until we've had some kind of sexual intimacy with that individual? The fact of knowing and knowledge, we're raising questions. Notice the word conceived here. It's the first time that it is used. This is the first child. Let's remind ourselves, according to the biblical text, Adam and Eve are both created as adults, it seems. Therefore, never children. They don't have an adolescence. They don't have an infancy, to at least from the biblical text. They're created as adults. In some ways, it asks the question, does this allow them, at least for you, a pass or an excuse for the disobedience of chapter 3? Of course, we'll ask this question, is Cain somehow already kind of cursed for by being the firstborn? We're gonna have a lot of different motifs in this biblical text about firstborns and the relationship between firstborns and secondborns, and then of course lastborns in some regards. We'll want to follow that as we study the biblical text together. Notice that Eve says she's produced a man with the help of God. There's a lot of wonder, creative power involved in this. There's some joy, obviously. There's also very interesting, really nothing from Adam here. Notice this is a song of Eve. It's kind of an interesting way to start our story. The name Cain, I should point out, Hebrew language very close to the translation here for create. And also, I should point out that there's a few scholars who have pointed out that the Kenite tribe, Numbers 24, 21 to 22, if you're interested in running this down, it's very possible that this is a tribe that was not well received, and this may be an etiology, as we were using that term in the last lecture, story of origins. This may tell us where the Kenite tribe comes from, in other words, ever related to Cain. Let's go back now to verse 2. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. Let's just point out that Abel also is an interesting name when translated. It's often translated as often vanity in the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. In Ecclesiastes, this was how it was translated. Ecclesiastes 1:2, 12:8. Sometimes as emptiness as well, which seems to anticipate in some ways maybe Abel's destiny, the shortness of his life, and to some degree, maybe we might say of all life. If you're interested, you can run down this one at Hebrews 11:4 as a passage to cross-reference, and Abel's faith as it's referred to there. Note the difference here in this verse between occupations. Notice that you have cultural differences potentially. You have the herders versus the growers. You have the ranchers versus the farmers. This is, of course, going to be a very old motif. We're going to see this often in literature as well, aren't we? Notice Abel as a keeper of sheep. We're going to have lots and lots of references to, of course, sheep and shepherds. We think, of course, of the most famous, Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Cain, we're told, is a tiller of the ground, which is interesting because, of course, that is what Adam was created for. Go back and take a look at Genesis 2 and then, of course, the comments in 3 as well. We're only 2 verses in, but let's begin with a few questions already that we want to ask. Well, what was Adam's profession, if we know what his sons did? And did his sons kind of watch Daddy growing up so that they knew kind of what they were supposed to do? And why no adolescent stories at all? How and by extension, how old do you think of Cain and Abel when this next part of the story happens? Do you see them as very young, adolescent age? Do you see them as adults? And how does that change the story for you? Let's go back now to verse 3, and we'll continue to read. "In the course of time, Adam brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground," and verse 4, and Abel for his part brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel in his offering, verse 5, but for Cain in his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So let's work now with verses 3, 4, and 5. Interesting use of terminology, right? In the course of time begs the question, how long? These stories often, as we pointed out already, sometimes we're more fascinated by what's not said or provided than what actually is. Were they adults, and how does this change the story for you if they're, for example, very young? Cain, we're told, brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. This obviously begs the question, is this some kind of early religious worship practice? We're not told. And why is there no explanation in regards to what some have called this as sacrifice, the early evidence of sacrifice? Sacrifice, you should put in your notes, is going to be a key concept in the Bible. We're going to want to pay attention to sacrifice, to the offering of sacrifices, and the ways in which sacrifices are either going to be accepted or not accepted, validated or invalidated. Verse 4, Abel, we're told, for his part brought firstlings of his flocks, their fat portions. This will obviously beg the question, is this teaching the reader about worship, and more particularly, God wants the best? And notice all the things that are missing here. Notice all the different kinds of information that we don't have. The Lord had regard for Abel in his offering. Is this a question of playing favorites? And to what degree does this even mean anything, that the Lord had regard for Abel? Verse 5, Cain and his offering, God has no regard for. Notice this is unexplained divine preference. We have a strong motif of this, by the way, in the Bible. For those of you that want to cross-reference this at 3a, Romans 9, 15, 16. I challenge you to take a look at that passage as it relates to this idea. Some see this as the birth in some ways of predestination, the idea that God chooses some to be saved and others not to be saved. You can run down your cross-referencing here with St. Augustine, among other thinkers, on this one. Now we'll continue with verse 5. Cain is very angry, notice. We have the first mention in some regards of this idea, this emotion of rage or anger. Sing, O goddess of the rage of Achilles, as the opening lines of the Iliad. We cannot help but think of references here to rage or anger, this powerful emotion. Question, is this a more powerful emotion than fear and shame, the emotions that we encountered, for example, at the end of the Eden story? Is it a more destructive emotion? That's going to be a legitimate question for us. We're also told here in verse 5 that Cain's countenance fell. His face, his countenance is upset. This seems to suggest that something maybe happened to his heart or to his mind. Note this is actually the first use of the word fall, we should point out. We don't have the word fall actually in Genesis 3, although it's often referenced as the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden story. Here actually the word fall is used, but it is in relationship to his face, his countenance. Of course, we could ask this question, is this the beginning of brother rivalry? This sometimes seems, in some readings, seems to suggest if you wish to play the blame game about who is responsible. Is God responsible, for example, because God chooses one versus not the other? We'll now come back to the story. We've got a very upset Cain because his offering has not been accepted. And now we'll ask what happens next. Verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Let's work with verses 6 and 7. I think there's some fascinating things happening here that we want to point out. Notice, first of all, God will speak in verse 6, and immediately we're paying attention again to the fact that God loves questions. It seems to be often, especially early in Genesis, a God of not so much declarative statements as questions that are going to be compelling for the reader. Notice, the last time God spoke to humans, it was actually to Cain's father. Let's not forget that, right? He asks, why are you angry? Why has your countenance fallen? Now, we should point out that it's not completely clear exactly why Cain is so angry, so upset, right? The text here leaves much for speculation. Of course, we have to ask as well about these two questions. Are they literal questions? Are they metaphoric questions? We already pointed out in our Genesis 3 study that sometimes we can interpret these questions as not just literal, but metaphoric. Notice the amazing poetic power here. We have a powerful word picture, a fallen face. I would like to point out to you as well at 3a, relationships to other texts. When you study the Bible, pay attention to comments about the face. It's a compelling way to study the text. Let's now continue. Verse 7. If you do well, will you not be accepted? But what exactly does this mean? Are we talking about the difference or the distinction between actions and motivations? What does accepted mean? For example, is Cain rejected? Are we being told that Cain has now been rejected? Does this suggest some kind of retributive justice? Do good, get good, do bad, get bad? Is this in some ways the beginning of the religious quest to be accepted by God? Note later, for example, ideas of heaven and hell. We think of Dante here in his Divine Commedia, of course, and especially the Inferno. To be rejected often in Christian theology will mean this notion of going to hell. Of course, this story is going to have a huge influence in Christian theology. Note here we have no mention of heaven or hell in this story. It's also a fascinating idea. But notice that sin is used for the first time, and we are told that it is lurking at the door. What a great verb. I mean, I would write that down in 2b. The writer of this text has compelling language to make the word picture so graphic for us. What's up with this lurking at the door? It suggests, for example, a wild animal. Notice we don't have the Genesis 2 story where Adam is naming all of the animals and every one seems to be living in peace and harmony with this reference. Notice there's the question of the sin is lurking at the door, but obviously the question is the door of what? The heart? Wow, there's a very compelling way to read this text. By the way, for those of you that are interested in this idea, 1 Peter 5:8 does suggest that sin is like a roaring lion seeking who it may devour. Notice it's sin, that is to say sin's desire is for you. How is this possible? Sin is external to Cain in some way? Is this the first example of demon possession, something coming in from the outside to possess Cain? Note the word desire. This is, of course, the second use of this word, right? 3:6, Genesis 3:6, we heard it before. A question, are we our desires? We think immediately of Freud, don't we, and the psychoanalytic ideas that he presented at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. By the way, this word desire is the same word that's used in Song of Solomon 7:10, so you can run that one down if you're interested as well. Notice the idea, you must master it. Whoa, what does that mean? Notice Cain's mom, Eve, could have probably used this advice back in Genesis 3, correct? Notice no mention here of how to master. Notice no mention of the word love here either. It's interesting. So we are left with all kinds of questions at the end of verse 7. Let's just list a few of them. As again, I'm trying to help you to become a closer reader of a text by learning to ask questions about the text, both what's said and what's not said. For example, where is mom and dad in all of this? Why are they absent? Why aren't they there to give counsel, to provide instruction, as we would assume parents are supposed to? Does God know what's going to happen? Should God have done more to stop what is about to happen, the first murder? Should he have, for example, told parents? Is this an example in our story here again of that debated concept of free will, although not mentioned in Genesis 3, not mentioned here? Is it still kind of this idea that deity or God is going to allow humans to make choices, and sometimes those choices are going to be bad ones? Why is sin personified as a wild animal? Is sin uncontrollable in that regards? And what about the question of human nature? Are we suggesting that humans are inherently bad? Are we suggesting that humans are inherently divine and good? This will be the question of Emerson and the American transcendentalists, so I think it's fair to raise it here. Notice the classic struggle of Hamlet we have going on here, Shakespeare's great tragedy. Remember from Hamlet, that we would do, we should do when we would. You'll maybe remember Claudius says in the fourth act. We think here as well of Romans 7:15. The idea is that there seems to be this dialectic or this struggle between, on the one hand, what I want to do, and on the other hand, what I need to do or what I should do. What does it mean to master sin here? Are we talking about self-discipline? We think immediately of Plato's four virtues. We think of, among other dialogues, the Republic, as we've talked about many times in 303. Think as well of all the brothers in the Bible who are aggrieved and don't get on and want to hurt the other. Immediately we'll think of Jacob and Esau, a couple of brothers that we're going to meet. Later we'll meet in the story of the prodigal son in the book of Gospel of Luke. Jesus will tell a story about two brothers that don't get on. Finally, this question, the blame game again. Is God to blame for what happens next? Well, let's take a look at what happens next. Let's go ahead. Verse 8. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Whoa. So let's go back now and take a look at verse 8 and the verses to follow, 9, and we'll come back to 10 and 11. We'll talk about this as premeditated murder. It certainly seems to be so. By the way, the opening lines here where Cain invites his brother, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient ether eyes on our table," is T.S. Eliot's opening lines of Proof Rock. This "let us go" is an interesting way for him to say this. Out into the field, notice, the isolation, which of course always leads to danger. Notice as well, out in the fields is away from the parents. We're told that he rose up against his brother. Notice it's not Abel, it's his brother. Seems to be driving that point home. Question though, did Abel have any idea what this was coming? Does Abel understand that God has rejected Cain's offering and accepted his? Is this something where Abel is aware, or is he innocent and completely ignorant? Naive, we might even say. Rose up seems to suggest the element of surprise, doesn't it? Notice, he killed him. Interesting here that the word is most often not translated as he murdered him, but rather he killed him. But we have no description of how, notice. But this is the first, not only murder, killing, it's the first death as well, we should point out. No comment about what happens afterwards. You'll remember in Shakespeare's great tragedy, Macbeth, Macbeth has difficulty living with the killing of Duncan and after he's done it. For example, he can't sleep very well, can he? We wonder, of course, about Cain and the way it's going to affect his psyche, his mind. Again, we ask questions, don't we? Where are the parents? Where is Adam and Eve? Why didn't Cain try maybe talking this one out? Why does he resort to violence? Did Cain know what he was doing was in fact wrong? There's been some debate about this. It seems pretty clear in the text that Cain knows that what he has done is something wrong. Lots of cross-referencing here at 3a, by the way. You can take a look at Matthew 23:35, Luke 11:50 through 51, Hebrews 11:4. All of these are fascinating correlative texts for this passage. Let's look at verse 9. Ask a few questions. Notice we have a conversation between God and Cain. This will be one of the important moments